There's not much to the Siberian landscape. The never-ending tundra stretches as far as the eye can see, bordered by the mysterious Arctic Ocean to the north. No forms of higher ground stop the deadly cold air from threading down to central and western Russia, burying its claws into people's skin, making their fingers numb and turning their words into clouds of gray steam. Not many people are brave enough to live far in the north. Brave, or completely mad. Dr. Brian Radley and his associates, Kevin Teller and Claire Hall, arrived at precisely 7:03 p.m. on February 17th. The airport near Norilsk was never crowded. They made their way outside to the minivan drivers who were standing there, chatting over cheap cigarettes. After a brief conversation with one of them, they got into a car that looked as if it were to fall apart at any second. Fortunately, the ride was not too long, and they got out into the overly polluted air of the city. The bus they needed to catch to get to the Norilskaya River was not leaving until next morning, so they checked into a motel that had seen better days. The heating was not working properly, so even under 3 woolen sheets, Dr. Radley felt chilly and didn't catch a second of sleep. His alarm clock informed him that it was time to wake up, and he turned it off. He was fully awake, but barely able to move due to the cold that snuck into his bones. After a poor breakfast, the team got to the bus station and into an old wreck of a bus that was to take them to the excavation point. The ride took longer than expected because of all the black ice on the patched road. Their destination lay ahead. Great white tents were being set up to keep the priceless artifacts safe, but the team was not interested in the objects a civilization once used. They were there for a greater reason. The excavators found a system of underground tunnels, which were still to be determined whether they were of a natural occurrence or man-made. For that, geologists were needed, and so the 3 were brought. A chill walked down Dr. Radley's spine when he saw the size of the entrance to the cave system. Surely no ancient civilization was able to dig through thick layers of solid rock, or so he thought. They were given a torch and a hard hat at the entrance, along with a walkie-talkie. The first thing that was noticeably odd at the entrance were the rocks themselves. They were not rough as in other caverns, but smooth as if they were patiently flattened. Dr. Radley and his colleagues entered the cave, even though the cold white sun was still up, merely proving that it was still daytime. Everything inside the cave was pitch black. Claire was the first one to turn her flashlight on. The light revealed little, but enough for the 3 to realize that the cave was enormous. The stone walls, smooth as silk, rose up and out of reach out of their flashlights. They needed more light. Dr. Radley exited the cave and went straight to the main tent. The other 2 wandered off in search of food. 2 days later, a truck came and brought phosphorescent lights needed to light up the cavern. It took 4 hours to completely install them, and once all the walls had been covered, the team went in again. The cavern was much bigger than they originally thought. The lights were well up on the wall, but they still couldn't see the ceiling. What's more, there were 3 more doors, similar to the cave entrance, just across the room. "Well, Brian, is this enough to prove that this cave is man-made?" asked Kevin. "You know the procedure well enough, Kev," replied Claire. "Yeah, but what are the odds of a naturally created cave system that looks like an ancient temple?" "Oh, well, you'd be surprised," said Dr. Radley. "Let's go out, get some sleep, and we'll come back first thing in the morning." Each of them had a separate tent with a warm sleeping bag and a reading lamp. Dr. Radley lay down and closed his eyes. It didn't take him long to fall asleep. His dreams were not pleasant. He was standing in a valley covered in a dense, macabre fog. Something was making him uncomfortable. The silence. The dreadful silence was ripping his mind apart. Suddenly there was a howl. Not a howl like a wolf's, but a ghastly howl that petrified him. Dr. Radley started looking around frantically and turned around to see a bloodshot eye. He woke up paralyzed, covered in cold sweat. The morning was cold. An ominous fog covered the archaeological camp. Kevin and Claire were already at the entrance to the cavern. Dr. Radley took his flashlight, hard hat, and walkie-talkie, and the group finally entered the cave. Dr. Radley thought he saw a glimmer of light in one of the tunnels, but it disappeared before he could take a closer look. "Well, should we go in that one or what?" Kevin asked eagerly. "Well, that's what they paid us to do, right?" Claire replied with a smile. Dr. Radley just shook his head and led the way into the middle tunnel. The tunnel was very dark, as if light from the main cave couldn't make its way inside. Hours seemed to have passed, but the three hadn't found anything interesting. It was just a long tunnel, and then suddenly Claire tripped. She fell down, grasping at the wall. "You alright?" Dr. Radley asked. "Yeah, I tripped on a rock or something. But hey, look at this." She pointed her flashlight at the wall. Something was inscribed into it. "What do you think this means?" Kevin asked. "Well, that's for the archaeologists to decide. Let's go back. I'm tired," Dr. Radley replied. He copied the symbols onto a scratch pad and started to turn to head out. He gasped, surprised, and froze in place. They were right at the start of the tunnel. It was as if they had only gone a few feet. They quickly walked out of the cave and into the cold Siberian air. "How is that possible?" asked Dr. Radley. "How is what possible?" Kevin replied with a question. "We've been in the tunnel for hours, Kevin, and we haven't moved an inch." "You ought to get some sleep, Brian," said Claire. "Yeah, maybe I should." They made their way to the main tent. An office was set up inside, and at the desk there was a man. "You seen anything interesting?" asked Dr. Thelonious Davis, an archaeologist. "Yeah, well, there was something inscribed into the tunnel's walls," Dr. Radley said, handing him the note. He decided not to let him know about what had happened. This is interesting. This writing was used by people who lived in Vincha 6,000 years ago. It's a sort of a Neolithic culture, but this makes no sense." "Well, what is it? What does it say?" asked Kevin. "It says PSOGLAV. "Well, what does that mean?" "I don't know. The historians and mythologists are not to arrive before tomorrow, and even that is questionable due to the blizzard that's coming." "Well, thanks anyway, Dr. Davis." Dr. Radley shook his hand and they left the tent. That night, Dr. Radley tried not to sleep, but his eyelids were too heavy. He fell asleep in an awkward position. He found himself in a valley covered with a dense fog. For a moment he thought he saw a shadow in the fog, but it disappeared. His heart started beating faster. Adrenaline rushed into his blood. He heard the sinister howl he heard last night, and he started running for his life. There were footsteps behind him, but they weren't footsteps. They sounded like hooves. He wanted to turn around, but he couldn't make himself do that. He started losing his breath and felt a searing pain in his lungs. He fell on the cold ground and turned his back. An eye was watching him, inches from his own. He woke up paralyzed, covered in cold sweat. His back was sore from sleeping on a cot. The morning was very cold. Dark gray clouds covered the sky. His colleagues were already in front of the cave entrance, waiting for him with his equipment. They entered the cave, and Dr. Radley stopped, petrified. He thought he heard a howl, the haunting howl from his nightmares. "Come on, Brian, don't tell me you're afraid of a little bit of wind," Kevin said, and he chuckled. They entered the left-hand tunnel. There was a glimmer of light somewhere in the distance, and Dr. Radley stood in place. Kevin insisted on checking it out, so Dr. Radley reluctantly continued with exploring. The further they went into the tunnel, the less the flashlights were effective. It was as if a dark fog was rising. Dr. Radley heard footsteps. But they weren't exactly footsteps. He was more frightened than he ever had been in his entire life. He started shivering. The three continued on and then finally reached a pile of rocks. "Well, this is a waste of time," said Kevin. "Wait, do you see that? The same symbols from the middle tunnel are inscribed here," Claire mentioned. "Yeah, but it seems as if these were done in a hurry. Maybe the people wanted to keep something out," said Kevin. "Let's go back. This is a dead end. We'll check out the third one tomorrow. We'll figure it out then," Dr. Radley said and started walking towards the exit. There was a howl that made fear sneak into Dr. Radley's heart. Then there were the hooves again. Now the other two were startled as well. They started running. They ran for what seemed like hours and finally reached the main cave. They rushed out. The snow was starting to fall. Their vision was blurred by the fog as well. They were stumbling through the rising blizzard, looking for a way to the main tent. A sinister howl ripped through the air, and the three started running even harder. They reached the tent by pure luck. "Hello, Dr. Radley. Have you reached a conclusion?" asked Dr. Davis. "We've come upon a dead end in the tunnel. It was covered in the symbols that I brought you yesterday. It looked as if someone wanted to keep something out." "Something," thought Dr. Radley. "Well, there's still one tunnel left. We'll go into the cabin before the blizzard takes its toll." Outside the tent stood a cabin. None of the three noticed it before, since it was finished while they were inside of the cave. Everybody else was inside, chatting over hot coffee, reading, or just resting. It was warm due to so many people in one place. "Is everybody here?" asked Dr. Davis. "No, doctor. We're missing 2 electricians. They never checked in after setting up the lights inside the cave." Dr. Radley's stomach turned. He thought he heard it again. The howl. He remained quiet, and he found his sleeping bag. He knew he would fall asleep, so he didn't even try to suppress it. It was dark. He couldn't see a thing. He heard another howl. The well-known shiver found its way back into his body. No matter how prepared he was, he couldn't stay brave. He heard hooves. The moon shone, revealing an eye staring at him. It was inches away from his face. He felt the stench of corpses. He tried to scream, but he couldn't. He saw a flash, and then woke up. And again he was covered in cold sweat. He heard scratching, and he couldn't make himself move. The scratching was getting louder and louder, and then it stopped. He heard a quiet growl, but then everything went silent yet again. Dr. Radley didn't sleep for the rest of the night. "Well, it's a good thing we aren't snowed in," said Dr. Davis the following morning. "What happened here?" he asked, looking at the door from the outside. "Probably wolves, doctor," said another man. "Yeah, perhaps you're right." Dr. Radley didn't want to go back into the cave, but that's what he was paid for. This time he was the first one in front of the entrance to it. "Hey, Doc, I didn't sleep well last night. I had this horrible nightmare," Kevin said. "You're probably just homesick," said Claire and smiled. They entered the cave and half the lights were out. A fog rose inside the cave. It was dark due to the lack of lighting. Dr. Radley saw a light down the right-hand tunnel, and despite his fear, he led his way into the tunnel. He heard hooves somewhere in the dark, but he couldn't tell if they were in front or behind him. Then there was silence. He couldn't even hear his own breathing. Not even the footsteps of his colleagues. He turned around and looked behind him, but there was no sign of the two. His heart thudded in his chest, and he started running back. There seemed to be no end. He couldn't decide which way was right. Dr. Radley tripped and fell. He dropped his flashlight, but picked it up just to see a pile of rocks like the one in the left-hand tunnel. But this one was different. There was a huge hole in it, and he finally realized the rocks were there to keep something inside. He heard the howl that he dreaded. The sound of hooves followed. He didn't want to make himself turn around, but he did. The abomination stood in front of him with his devil-like horns and monstrous arms on the ground. Its body reminded him of a human, yet it was larger. But its head was a hound's head with a single red eye in the middle. The creature let out a growl and charged. Kevin and Claire soon rounded the corner to where Dr. Radley had just been standing. They had heard him scream, but could find nothing of him except for a few drops of blood. When the weather let up, Dr. Davis called in a rescue team. Dr. Radley and the two electricians were never found. They sealed the cave, never quite finding out what happened to the missing people.